Hello, it's now 2022. Years of waiting have finally led up to it. We're here. There's 3 of the same number in the year now, which is really lovely. It's gonna make writing the year easier. That's the only preamble that I came up with in the 5 minutes before shooting when I realized I'd probably have to come up with a preamble. Anyway, I'm going to talk about some things that I really like. Specifically, only 4 things this year, which is a marked contrast from previous years in which I've talked about a whole lot of things. The 4 things this year, as a result, are all fantastic. In previous years, though there hasn't been necessarily filler, there have been a number of instances in which I've used information or talked about media which I didn't feel perhaps as passionately about as I do about the 4 things in this video. I really like all of these. I decided, not consciously, but maybe half-consciously mid through the year, to make a smaller list. This amounted late in December, in which I tried to compile the list, and I could only really think of 4 things that were equally as good as each other that should be on the list. 2021 was a very good year for me, despite the state of the world right now. I've done a lot of stuff. Notably, I've finished high school, which is a lovely burden lifted. Now that I'm out of high school, I can allocate my time where I please, which is significant and lovely. It gives me a lot of time to focus on the things that I want to do. I'm working roughly as hard, if not slightly harder, on my own personal work than I did on high school, and I worked very hard on high school. In the past year, in January of the past year, almost a year away now, as it is the 4th of the 1st, 2022 as of filming, I released the video game Cinematographer. I'm very happy with it still, I think it's great. Later in the year, and though I didn't tell this to people directly, I exhibited some of my work in Melbourne Museum. That was pretty cool for me. I got to go to a museum opening. That will not be the last. I will find another way to get my work back in a museum one day. Maybe they'll let me project something onto a T-Rex. Additionally, along in my high school experience, though I did many things in my high school experience, mostly study, I also got time to do a few cool things. I got an offer I got one offer, and an offer I accepted to play unreleased music of mine in a school assembly. That was pretty cool. I made a 2-minute video set and I played it in front of the school. I was very excited about that. I'd had a secret thought that looped through my mind for a long time. It's like, what if I get to play music at an assembly and everyone can hear the music I make? And it happened, which was nice. I've graduated high school, as I said. Additionally, I've gained offers to 2 universities, which I'm happy with. I gained early offers. They were conditional, but I haven't passed all the conditions, so I'll be going in the coming year. This is very nice. I'm going to be studying game design in a professional capacity. I'm going to, as much as working to earn a wage permits, be working all the time on my creative work. Not in a job, I'll also be doing a job all the time, but I'll be working creatively all the time as well. I have enough willpower to allow myself to do so. The selection and vetting process for this video was not exactly loose, but it isn't hyper-academic either. Over the course of the year, I consume a lot of media. I listen to music predominantly whilst running in the evenings. I play video games between usually 7:30 a.m. to about 9 a.m., making for an hour and a half in the mornings most days. I treat this both as entertainment and also as research. It's important to me that I know what other games are in the culture right now. And I think it's an important part of being an artist. You have to have an eye on what's going on in order to make your own works in respect to it. I consume books in quarters. I figure out how many pages are in the book, I divide that by 4, and from there I read a quarter each time. I often read 2 quarters, which makes a half. I do a whole lot of stuff when I read a book. I like to imagine things when I look at the book. It's a special technique that only I do. In terms of consuming music, I've written on my notes, of which I have constructed essay-style discussions on each of the media I'm talking about. I've written that I listen to music in discography order. In all honesty, this started in about September. It doesn't happen it started happening in September and it's still happening. I start from the start of an artist's discography and I listen to usually an album per day, permitting I don't have other things to do. From there, I'm able to get an idea of how they evolved as an artist across their trajectory. It's given me greater insight into the way musicians develop. This is important for me as somebody who makes music to get in terms of informing my own practice. Artwork is included in these lists, these end of year lists, or in this case, very early this year list, very early the next year list, if it is consistently excellent on repeat interaction. I don't judge them by immediate initial dopamine response. I prefer to come back to it a lot of times. If I can continually find it wonderful on repeat listen, it becomes a favorite and I include it. There are 4 entries on this list, as previously stated. Each of those in terms of preparing for this video, I interacted with each of those again for about 5 hours. For the album, I listened to it through it twice. This took me about 5 hours. I read the book from start to finish. This took me about 7 hours. I finished the first video game I'll talk about. Going from almost finishing to finishing the game took me roughly 5 hours. The second game I didn't finish. I just played 5 hours of it. I wanted to finish it, but it's difficult to finish because it's sort of a clumsy game. You don't really get to set goals and then follow them. You just kind of have to go with what it's doing. The content order of the media I'll talk about in this list is video games, then books, then music. Video games are positioned at the start because there are 2 of them. Books, there is only 1 of them, but it seemed to come before the album I wanted to talk about in terms of the intensity with which I wanted to talk about it. I want to put the things that I want to talk about most at the end. It makes me want to get to them and get excited throughout reading. They're not excited to the point of being irrational. That's not my point. You might understand. Anyway, the first media I'm talking about today is Yakuza 0. The game that was released in 2018, I believe, which makes it, as of this year, 4 years old. Though it was likely released mid-year and not on January 4th, so it's probably more like 3.5 years old. I'm going to preface each media, except for the second video game, with a series of tips of how to interact with it. I love all of these. I deeply recommend that you go seek them out or you interact with them in some way. That's really important. I mean, If you'd like, you can go out and play, read, and listen to all of these before listening to me talk about them. It's fun to do that. You can form your own opinions before you hear somebody else talk about something and get a more nuanced view yourself. Anyway, with Yakuza 0, the tips are: 1. Listen to all the dialogue in full. I know it's in Japanese and you read subtitles, but if you're watching a video like this, you probably like reading subtitles. I like reading subtitles. The voice acting's really good. You should listen to it. If you skip through it all the time, the pacing of the conversations becomes jarring and you lose out on a lot of the story, which is a lovely aspect of the whole. Additionally, the second tip is play leisurely. There are a bunch of set-piece style missions throughout Yakuza 0. If you play these end to end, you experience a fatigue in which the story sort of loses its luster as you're continually seeing the sort of heights of what it has to offer. It's like if you watched a soap opera but you cut out every episode before all of the climaxes and you just watched all the climactic episodes in sequence. It would suck. You gotta have the downtime. Therefore, I recommend that in between missions you play 2 to 3 sub-missions. There's also simulated mahjong. You should play mahjong, it's pretty fun. I've played it a couple of times. I don't really know what I'm doing with it, but, you know, I'm learning. It's fun to do. Also, third and final tip, turn off the mini-map. The miniature map that shows in the bottom right-hand corner of gameplay, I don't know because I've turned it off, causes you to disconnect from the world of the game in a way. You can sort of watch your character as a little arrow traversing around the map. Whenever a game has a mini-map, it makes me wonder if I could play the game without the graphics and only looking at the mini-map. And I think a sad amount of time the answer is yes. If you turn the map off, you can still use the full map on the select screen, but you're not looking at the mini-map all the time, and you actually gain an understanding of the space you're in. You'll learn to navigate better as well. It's a better experience. It's in the settings menu. Anyway, without further ado, let's talk about Yakuza 0, a video game from a thematic perspective. Well, sort of thematic. I've arranged these into my notes into essay structures. I took notes while I was re-looking back through all of these media, and then now arranged into a basic three essay paragraph structure. Yakuza 0 is an interesting game from a number of perspectives. 1, in its demonstration of violence, 2, in its demonstration of empathy for its characters, and 3, in how it concludes the character arcs of its characters. It's important to track these in gaining an understanding of perhaps what the game has to say about the nature of humans. It's not that interested in crime so much as it is in the brutal systems which cause crime to happen, or the cultures in which crime exists. The first point of note is the violence in the game. It's a violent game in many ways, sometimes in a goofy sense, sometimes it presents itself seriously. However, it is violent. And this is linked back to a greater thematic idea, I suppose, of organizations founded on violence, predominantly the titular Yakuza. The main first point, there's an undercurrent of disgust throughout the whole game, not necessarily represented within the game, but felt by the player, especially if the player continually goes through missions and receives violent set piece after violent set piece. It really wears after a while. There's a sense that the characters are unable to resolve any conflict without violence. This is true. This is how the story operates. A core part of the disgust comes from characters within the text not being able to live for themselves. They live for others, or they live for ulterior motives, or they live for some idea of profit or gain. The first example you see of this is the protagonist Kiryu's friend, or I think in the context of the story, oath brother Nishikiyama. He basically only lives for Kiryu until very late in the game. His role within the narrative is Kiryu's oath brother, and he doesn't demonstrate a huge amount of personality of his own. You only hear about what he's doing when he's tagging along with Kiryu, and he doesn't interject with his own life much. It's sad. You want people within real life and stories, just in general, to be able to live not for a specific reason, but because they like living and because they care about themselves. But most of the characters within the text are unable to have that happen. Late in the game, one of the Yakuza lieutenant Kuze, one of the Yakuza lieutenants, Kuze, directly states he is exclusively living for a man's pride. I think that pretty clearly indicates that people not living for themselves is an intentional feature of the narrative, rather than an unintended inference that I've made. Not that an unintended inference would change anything. You can read thematically from stuff that the developers or artists of any piece of media didn't intend. You should also consider perhaps what they did intend and chalk those up or expect those in relation to one another. An additional feature of the violence and disgust is that the character or the entire plot revolves around an empty piece of land. That empty piece of land becomes connected through narrative circumstances to a girl without the ability to see. The fact that such brutal power struggles emerge from a defenseless woman and a piece of land with literally nothing in it that's about 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters square serves to illustrate the hypocrisy and mad power struggles that underline the violence in these institutions. It's a really gorgeous piece of narrative structuring. It also heightens empathy. Makimura, the blind girl, is defenseless. No one will explain her role to her in the overarching power struggle until very late in the game. It's easier for the sort of violent men, the Yakuza within the plot, to try to kill her rather than explain basically to her what is going on. It's awful. You feel for her and you want her to be okay. The players gain a sense of opposition to the enemy Yakuza in that they have empathy and the enemies seem to have very little, or whatever they had is heavily repressed. The players define themselves in opposition to the people they beat up. It helps out the game. The fundamental statement the game makes about the Yakuza as an institution is that its base power is in violence. Once its thin veneer of diplomacy is pulled away, basically all it has is intimidation tactics and brutality. The Yakuza Lieutenant Awano, differing from Kuze, states, "I became a Yakuza because I liked hitting people. I didn't fight because I was pissed at the other guy." These are, for a large reason, people who like fighting other people. They don't really do it for a reason. I mean, they formed a way to make money around it, but they're fighting people nonetheless, basically for the reason that they want to. Violence is masked by these men as necessity. Kuze directly claims that I only did what I had to do after being complicit in the death of a major character, specifically Tachibana. This video contains spoilers if you haven't realized by now. You should play this game before you listen to me talk about it further, or you should play the games and read the books and listen to the music before I talk about them. Seriously, it's important. Anyway, the violence obviously isn't necessity, and there's always a second route out. Yet the men in power and the antagonists of the game never take it. In many ways, the protagonists also don't take it. They're consistently violent, though the game contextualizes it differently in a way that's fairly interesting, and I'll talk about later. Inescapable violence is in normal gameplay, in terms of the fact that you have to repeatedly fight people to progress in the story. It's also in the set-piece cutscenes. People are regularly dying in the game. The set-piece fights as well. Basically every major story beat is resolved through the combat system. It's pretty nasty at the end of the day. Next in the discussion order is how the game approaches empathy. It's a really interesting subject to talk about because Yakuza is often seen as a game which is more empathetic than other major AAA titles. I'm not certain about this. It is a lot of the time, but there's also factors in which it's not, and in which its judgments of violence and love and connection between people are a bit strange. It's definitely worth talking about and thinking about, and how it is indicative of the sort of content in major AAA titles of our day. Violence specifically is justified by the plot when it is motivated by love. Yakuza are only capable of violence when their diplomacy is removed. However, Majima and Kiryu, the dual protagonists of the game, use violence. However, they're motivated by their care for others. The game portrays this as justifying their actions. They are either acting in self-defense or they're acting to protect someone. However, they still use essentially the same tactics. Their morals importantly allow them within the story of the game to forego the usual conduct of the Yakuza though. They don't always act in violence, they often act in a way contrary to what their superiors are telling them to do. This portrays them as different from the organizations with which they operate or have operated in past or previously to the story's events. The most interesting trait of the game's exploration of empathy is its deconstruction of strength within the lives of its characters. This happens a couple of times, most prominently with Majima and Tachibana. Tachibana starts the game and his introduction is introduced in a high penthouse overlooking the fictionalized city district of Kamurocho. He's portrayed as a complete mastermind. He has the city under his thumb, he's confident, assured, he knows what he's doing. However, over the course of the game, it's continually revealed that he is further and further from that idea of masterminded control. It's presented, no character within the game is presented as having complete control. This is most clear in the presence of him needing regular kidney dialysis as a result of a condition. He is physically enfeebled. He hides this initially, which gives him an impression of strength. However, over the course of the game, he loses that. You begin to see him less as a figurehead of power and more as a regular human who is acting in a way that demonstrates is trying to act in a way that demonstrates strength.
Hello, this is the first of several asides that will be recorded throughout the video. I'm using this aside to cover for a section of the original video in which I'm talking to the driver about the route. It's not that they don't want their voice in the video or anything, they're in it several other times, but it's mostly out of a dislike for the way I was acting socially at that point. I was in sort of public presentation mode rather than in a social interaction mode. My mannerisms come across very strangely. I don't want to include it because I don't want anybody to emulate that, and I don't want people to feel that's the way I act with other people. I'm generally not self-conscious. This is not an action of being self-conscious. This is about not wanting to model something that I think's bad. Anyway, right in this aside, I'm going to talk about how to source the media I discuss within this video. This does include spoilers for later video sections. This does include spoilers for later topics within the video. If you don't want that, you can skip this little bit. When the title of the video is no longer on screen, I won't be doing the aside anymore. Yakuza 0 is pretty easy to get your hands on. There is a physical release available and it's only a few years old, so you can get it. It's on Steam and it's on other online storefronts. I purchased it on the Microsoft Store on my Xbox One. It's good that way. Doshin the Giant is a little more difficult to get a hold of, seeing as it's an old game. If you have a GameCube, you can buy the disc. If you're willing to be sneaky, there are ways to get the game online. If you're watching this, you probably know how to do that. However, if you want to go through legal channels, you can ROM dump Doshin the Giant from its GameCube disc. There are guides online to do that. If you do end up buying it, there's some worthwhile physical artifacts associated with the game. The Nintendo 64 disc drive packaging specifically is absolutely gorgeous. It's got this really lovely sort of stone pattern print on it, which recalls the ideas of primitive civilization contained within the game. There's also on eBay a couple of interesting relics. There's a alleged around the year fan art book from around the year 2000. It's listed on eBay and there are photos and it looks really legitimate, but I've not been able to find any scans of it online. There's also a strategy guide, which like an official paperback strategy guide, which is sold in quite a few locations, but there are no scans of this online. So if you do buy either of those, I really do encourage you to scan them. I put them on the Internet Archive if you want, or just on an archive somewhere, they'd be good. Things do go missing on the internet. It would be nice to have access to these. If nobody else does, I might buy them myself. And the Nintendo 64 disc drive packaging can be found high-resolution photos of the Nintendo 64 disk drive packaging can be found on the Internet Archive. I realize at this point my aside has gone longer than the length of the removed section. There'll probably be some dark space here, or I might just loop the removed section. Anyway, how can you obtain Simon Ing's Hothead, which is a book I talk about later in this video? It's not that hard. There was an original 1992 release, and then there's also a 2014 paperback re-release. They're both paperbacks, actually. The 2014 paperback is readily available for physical order online, or can be bought for a couple of dollars on Kindle if you like reading that way. I'm not a particular fan of it, though I can definitely understand the perks of it. The 1992 paperback potentially has a nicer cover. I like it a little bit more than the 2014 one, which is more focused on being uniform with Ing's other work than it is on being individually great. Regardless, both are good. I've only read the 2014 paperback. It has a few punctuation and spelling errors, or not spelling, but mostly punctuation or weird little gaps in phrasing. I don't know if those are in the original 1992 paperback. I can't report on that. So that one might require your investigation. Finally, Frank Ocean's Blond, which is the final topic of discussion in the video. Blond is fully available via Spotify. However, Spotify is generally not a good service to use in how it supports its artists, and I also just find its UI annoying. I dislike the amount of ads. Anyway, there is only one way I can find that you can own legitimately the physical files associated, or the files associated with Blond, and have them on your computer for your own use. You have to, 1, install the iTunes desktop app, the actual program iTunes, which is still running even though Apple doesn't really sell just basic iPods anymore, and then purchase Blond via iTunes. iTunes will then, after you purchase it and choose to download it, save Blond in files to your computer in a .m4a format. You can then convert those files in Audacity if necessary. This is the only legal method I know that you can use to locally own Blond, otherwise it's more or less streaming exclusive. It works just fine. Anyway, back to the main video.
The core, an interesting element of the deconstruction of strengths with Tachibana is the manner in which he starts in the high penthouse as this sort of figurehead of strength, and then by his demise, or the conclusion of his demise, he's underground. He progressively moves further and further physically down through the rungs of society. It's interesting. It's interesting thematic and visual storytelling, which isn't really, never directly addressed by the game. It's nicely subtle for a major AAA release. They wouldn't usually tell you directly, but it's good. It's well written, and I think it's, I'm not sure literary, but I thought it was interesting. Majima, the second protagonist other than Kiryu, is, in his introduction, the Lord of the Night. He runs a cabaret bar and is able to manipulate a drunken man into paying the tab of everybody in the bar. He's portrayed as having supreme social control. However, it's quickly revealed that the Lord of the Night is a front he puts on socially, and he's actually under constant watch by members of the Yakuza. He's basically just trying to make ends meet, and is dealing with a crushing sense of guilt for the jailing of his previous oath brother, someone equivalent to him as Nishikiyama is to the protagonist Kiryu. Both Tachibana and Majima are portrayed as gaining competence from their prior traumas and hardships. This is shown within Tachibana's childhood as a war orphan and Majima's time spent, I don't think it's directly stated, but implied at least over a year spent a situation of torture. They've both lived through terrible stuff, and it's given them the ability to be somewhat stronger or present a front of strength. The game is interested in whether the ideas of strength that are portrayed within most narratives are actually possible within real people, and what conditions within real people, or what conditions within the lives of real people would drive them towards that idea of a heroic, traditionally narrative strength. That's a very interesting point of exploration in the game, which could have easily turned to just demonstrating crime as maybe condemning crime, or demonstrating it as sometimes legitimized. It's an interestingly nuanced view. However, the game's empathy is still flawed, and pretty large in some places. There was, several years ago, a video that I watched which describes the Yakuza series as very empathetic. It specifically stated a mission in which the protagonist assists a prospective dominatrix with increasing her self-confidence as a good example of a sort of minority sexual space, I guess. And having played through that mission myself, while it could be read that way, it also has flaws in its overall empathy. The main issue is that the game, this is not the issue, I'm just changing my topic a little bit. The game always represents every character, minority or not, or sort of joke character or not, as being human and having understandable desires and motivations. That's first and foremost in its ideas. However, minority characters, while being portrayed as having desires and motivations,
Hello, welcome to the second of two asides. In my last newsletter concerning the release of 91W, I claimed I was going to learn the Dewey Decimal System before the audience received more of my work. Here is a demonstration of the Dewey Decimal System. Each 3-digit number that books are assigned within the Dewey Decimal System refers to a specific book subject. Decimals can be used to designate more specific text contexts, and call numbers for books are arranged in categories based on the 100 the number occurs within.
The game, despite demonstrating minorities as human and having human desires, still presents them sometimes with an air of comedy surrounding the idea that they are taboo in some way, or their identities are taboo. It's not directly predatory or, I think, intentionally trying to direct ire towards them. However, it definitely comes across. The dominatrix mission is still presented as comedy. It's meant to be uncomfortable that the main character is interacting with somebody in this this sort of sexual interest or this sort of career. It's not presented straight up as a respectable thing to do. I think that's worth noting. It's not perfect representation. That said, Yakuza as a whole is largely more empathetic than most video games. It still does portray every character as human, understandable, and having their own desires and motivations. That's importantly different from a lot of games in which characters are treated as basically a way to move forward the story or a way to have the plot move. The final point of note about the game is the way it resolves its characters' arcs, which I think is very useful. Here's an essay writing tip. Centering the last paragraph on the conclusion of a narrative is a good way to write essays. They usually sum up all the themes within the narratives. If you're in high school, maybe try it. It's useful. If you're not in high school and you're writing essays, which is highly respectable, it's also useful. Check out this truck. Anyway, the conclusion of the game, in terms of the arcs of its protagonists, Majima and Kiryu, is mostly centered on an idea of self-definition in opposition or in contrast to the oppressive moral codes or oppressive social codes within which the Yakuza operate. I think that the turning point for the narrative is Masaru Sera's arrival on the rooftop following the point at which Makimura is shot. It is a reversal of narrative polarity. There's an established setup within the narrative in which characters are killed off at the end of a chapter. It happens a fair few times in a row. By having Sera arrive, it signals to the player that the conditions of the narrative have changed. The downward spiral, which causes the player to feel disgust, is briefly curtailed. There's a sense of optimism in it. An idea that actually we can make this better, we can escape from these moral codes and these systems which of men which present themselves as faultless and all-consuming, but are ultimately still flawed and have gaps. The protagonist's ultimate conclusions are liberation from their internalized violent codes that they have at the start of the narratives. Majima and Kiryu's respective adherence to the power structures of the Yakuza are portrayed as negative throughout the narrative, throughout the entire text. In Majima's case, Sotenbori, the other fictionalized city district in which he lives is referred to repeatedly as his cage, which he is kept in by the Yakuza. This is both a physical reference to the fact that he can't leave, but also revolves around the idea of him being constricted by his wish to return to the Yakuza, or his wish to maintain a certain social position in which he expects himself to act in a specific way and to continue violence, essentially. He doesn't directly intend to, but he inadvertently does so. Sagawa, Majima's superior, claims that, in quotes, that son of a bitch finally bust out of his cage, in this conclusion in which he refuses to act on orders and decides to act upon his own morals. He defines himself by what he wishes to do, rather than what other people are sort of forcing him to do in order to maintain his place within the social hierarchy. Kiryu is more consistently liberated from power structures over the course of the text. He is kicked out of the Yakuza very early on. It's interesting that he chooses to return to them at the conclusion of the narrative, though I'll discuss that further in a second. A core aspect of Kiryu's advancement, though, or the liberation of characters from violent codes, is Nishikiyama, his blood brother, oath brother, who I previously referred to as kind of disgusting and that he only lives for Kiryu, preventing Kiryu from killing the main antagonist, Yakuza Lieutenant Shibusawa, who emerges by the last several chapters. Nishikiyama refusing to allow Kiryu to kill Shibusawa inverts the rhetoric that is presented throughout the majority of the narrative of Kiryu or Majima, of Kiryu having to become a true Yakuza, which is repeatedly stated by Yakuza lieutenants. It's portrayed in Nishikiyama preventing Kiryu from killing as actually a false idea. A true Yakuza is not based on any idea of killing, and people should really define themselves by their own standards rather than define themselves in a specific way so they can remain within a social group. That's, pretty important, I think. People within our world in real life in separation from the narrative continually limit their personalities and their self in order to fit within a specific group. This happens constantly. I think a narrative reflecting on that in a way that a major or AAA narrative, one that is definitely interested in market appeal, focusing on the idea of defining yourself for your own motivations instead of for a major group, is important. That's a lesson that actually might help people. Art can, as one of its uses, help people. Not that art always has to have a direct use, though. More and more recently, I'm interested in the idea of designing for an audience rather than specifically only for my own tastes. I'm therefore impressed whenever a narrative has something good to say to the people who interact with it. It's good stuff. It's nice when a narrative is trying to help people in some way, or a text is. The final conclusion of Majima's and Kiryu's arcs are genuinely interesting. Kiryu's is a little easier to interpret than Majima's, though they're both respectively good ends to their to themes and to character arcs. Majima chooses to live freely, crazy as that may be. He eschews having steel-toe crocodile skin boots for having I think like a snakeskin jacket. It rules. I like kind of crazy jackets. I like that plaid insert Japara that I was wearing earlier. It's very nice. It's a practical jacket and it looks good. Plaid is a nice pattern. Kiryu's ultimate resolution, Majima's ultimate resolution is that he is free from his cage of moral ideas of conforming to the social order, but also that he's freed from his guilt for the imprisonment of his oath brother. He recognizes that that wasn't something that he had any control over, and ultimately resolves to live life for himself rather in preparation for the return of another. This is pretty significant. He starts the game with his basic motivation being to return to the Yakuza so that he can secure a position for his oath brother when he returns. Majima importantly refuses to intervene in Makimura's life within the end of the narrative, despite having spent a large amount of the text assisting her in basically trying to survive and get her life back to a state of normalcy. He allows that to continue for her, whilst also no longer defining his actions even by a wish to protect her. He simply wishes to act for himself. Kiryu decides to take his own path. His decision to return to the Yakuza, though initially strange, is a really potent way of demonstrating to the audience that he's refusing to live by the expectations of anyone, even by what the audience might consider to be good sense. Also, his outfit changes as well. I understand that Yakuza 0 is a later made prequel to other entries in the series, and the conclusion of the game has Majima and Kiryu move into the outfits they demonstrated in the first Yakuza game. That said, we can still make inferences or thematic readings based on the outfits that the designers chose to give them prior to them gaining their outfits from the first game at the end of the prequel. Kiryu's final suit is grey. Its undershirt is red. The grey outer layer is pretty on-the-nose reference to moral greys. His previous suit was white with black stripes, and the final chapter of the game is called Black and White. It's pretty clear about that. He directly states, I think, I don't feel black and white much anymore. That one's very intended by the designers, and they want you to know that. That said, there's also an interesting observation to make about his inner shirt. His previous inner shirt was orange with chains. The chains can be seen as representative of oppressive, violent social codes. The orange can be seen as a not yet matured form of the red which constitutes his undershirt. The red in it resembles the color of the heart and of blood, and therefore symbolizes vitality and determination. He becomes more human. He has more understanding of his own humanity and the humanity of others. He chooses to act in opposition to social codes based on his own ideals and to become his own man, I suppose. He directly states he wants to find my own way as a Yakuza, different from Kazuma-san's. Kazuma being his significant role model who he continually references throughout the game and who plays a large sort of behind-the-scenes position. Kiryu's deciding to define himself by himself. This is a pretty interesting... I don't know, I've said before, I think this stuff is interesting coming out of a AAA game which could have just turned into basically a damnation of crime or a judgment of empathy or an idea of empathy and love foregoing the need for crime. Instead, it's actually interested in the personal struggles and arcs of its characters in a really meaningful way. That's the end of talking about Yakuza. I stumbled a little bit. I'm getting better at it and I'm learning the rhythm which I need to talk to a camera whilst looking at written notes in the back of a moving car. It takes a little learning. I've never done this before. I might never do this again, but, you know, life does interesting things. Just saw a poster. They're making a Scream remake. I didn't know about that.
Remake of what?
A remake of the movie Scream.
Oh.
Yeah. I've never watched any of the Scream movies. I will. I plan to interact with basically every significant piece of media from the last 50 years, if possible.
Shit, that is what?
Somebody's got it, and as an artist, it's an important thing to do. You have to understand the culture in order to make things within it. I'm going to take a swig of water. My throat is filling with stuff. I've been talking really loudly for a while. If you can hear me glugging the water, I might diminish the levels for a second. I know a lot of people really hate the sound of eating and drinking. Water's a good beverage. I think it's underrated. I think water's underrated.
For a second there I was going to be like, yeah, I prefer vodka. And then I'm like, hang on, I'm driving.
For reference, I specifically wrote in the OH&S notes that I made while planning this that I wouldn't allow any filming to occur if the driver was under the influence of alcohol or drugs. I haven't had them breathe in a breathalyzer, but they don't seem that way, so I think we're good.
It's alright, I'm not doing stuff.
The next game I'm talking about is the 2002 GameCube port of the Nintendo 64 disc drive game Doshin the Giant. I would refer to this game for many years before playing it early this year as just sort of an example of an obscure game which I found interesting or that I wanted to talk about. You want to talk about the root again?
No, I'm just thinking.
Oh, sure. Doshin the Giant is a pretty interesting game. While a lot of games, I think, push towards some degree of futurism, or if they go into the past, they rely on fantasy ideas, there's few games that I can think of immediately which are interested in the prehistoric in a way that's not... What I mean by prehistoric is not necessarily dinosaurs, but the idea of how time and human civilization and folklore and stuff existed before we had an idea of history, or we had an idea of even ways in which to define the times in which we lived. Those kind of early growth phases of the human race in which we were still sort of working stuff out for ourselves. I mean, we still are more than sort of working stuff out right now, but it's a different period, and I think it's an interesting one to look into. Doshin the Giant engages with it in a very direct way. It's the only game I've interacted with that feels like existing as part of a cultural origin narrative, a sort of myth that might exist. The core setup of the game is Doshin the Giant is potentially from outside of the game materials an embodiment of the sun, though some sort of nature being who emerges from the ocean each morning onto an island, which is called Boruto Island. Most of this stuff is not directly stated in game, as in out exterior materials that you can find. The Doshin goes about the island tending to the villagers of said island. You can raise and lower the ground, you help them build towns, or you help them basically facilitate the conditions for them to build towns, and eventually they build monuments. It's a pretty chilled out game. There's not a huge amount of... There's nothing directly telling you what to do. You kind of do things at your own pace, and you don't move particularly quickly, which causes the player to have to take it easy a bit and relax about things. It's a good game to play for 5 hours, as I did for this video. It's a game that is nice to play without any light bulbs, or just lowering the window, or raising the curtains and letting natural light in. It's a very natural light kind of a game. Potentially you could drink some green tea while doing this and it'd be really nice. You can drink green tea anytime, it's pretty nice, but during this. Anyway, Doshin the Giant is specifically interesting on closer analysis in how it engages with the role of the player as representative of a god, or as representative of potentially a higher power than even Doshin the Giant themselves, and how there is an intentional disconnect between Doshin, the human player characters, and the player themselves. It's really interestingly and precisely constructed in a way that asks the player a lot of questions about their own involvement and forms a greater thematic idea of coexistence and of the ability of many different entities to be able to make mistakes. Nature, humans, everybody makes mistakes, and then there's an idea of reconstructing trust after these mistakes have been made. This is communicated effectively through gameplay. The first paragraph of this pseudo-essay is called The Player as God. The player, immediately on starting the game, recognizes that they have supreme awareness compared to the villagers. Only the player knows the objective of the game. Doshin is portrayed by a continual gormless expression as kinda hapless. The player doesn't really identify with Doshin a whole lot. Doshin doesn't exactly follow the player's inputs.
I heard the camera beep.
Hello. The dialogue you are currently hearing, or the narration you are currently hearing, constitutes something a little more in line with the main video than my previous asides. There was a segment of video here where I wasn't recording through the lavalier mics that were attached to my shirt, and I I thought that the camera microphone, the directional microphone that I use as the audio throughout the first parts of this video, was plugged in at this time. The lavalier mics weren't running. However, it turns out neither of them were running, so I just don't have audio for this bit. The directional mic was plugged in, but it had fallen out slightly and its input becomes garbled. I can't really make any sense of it. So I lost basically my discussion of the whole first body paragraph of my structured discussion surrounding Doshin the Giant, which I'm going to redo now and then put into the video. This video's technical elements have been a little bit of a mess. I lost the footage for the late half of this video, in which the sunset that you see inklings of in these sections turned to night as we drove further out into the country. It was really beautiful at the time. I wish I had that footage, but it does give me room for improvement in future years, in which I will have a more rigorous plan and a greater technical understanding from which I can develop the video. There are actually only about 3 minutes remaining. Well, I have a timer. There are 3 minutes 42 seconds remaining of actual footage that I have to talk about Doshin the Giant in, or the footage I recorded before the cameras cut out. However, there's more to talk about in this section in terms of Doshin the Giant than I can fit in 3 minutes. So I'm just going to go as long as I need to, and at some point during this discussion, I'm going to have to cut to an interstitial graphic because the camera stopped recording at that point and there's no more to see. Anyway, as previously stated, the first body paragraph of this section is called The Player as God. Doshin the Giant is a pretty interesting game in the way it treats its player, or in the way the player contextualizes themselves within the world of the game. The first thing of note is that the player has supreme awareness compared to the in-game villagers, who are the other humans within the game. The fact that Doshin Doshin is humanoid, but he's not human, actually. So the player is encouraged to identify both with Doshin as the player character, but also with the in-game villagers who are of the same species. The player compares themselves to these villagers and finds themselves to be much more aware than the villagers, who are basic AI constructs. Not even AI constructs. They kind of wind their way around and ask you to do things. I don't know if I would call them having artificial intelligence so much as programmed behaviors. It's a bit different. Anyway, the player, additionally, as well as being smarter than the in-game characters, which is kind of the basis of any game, but has Doshin the Giant call specific attention to it. The player is also the only entity with awareness of the game's rules or objective. This complements their role as a god through Doshin, or Doshin's role as a god. The player acts as a god through Doshin, who acts as a nature embodiment, and they both, in tandem and cooperation, act onto the humans. The humans' limited AI furthers the player's sense of unique competence. Within the context of the game as well, there is no one Doshin the Giant. Every night the Doshin you were playing as in the previous day goes away or sinks back into the ocean somehow. How they actually exit the game world is unclear, but they stop moving and the player is unable to see what happens to them beyond that. The next day, the Doshin the Giant the player inhabits is a new Doshin the Giant. It's not a member of a species, but it's a new Doshin. It's a new day, a new Doshin. This furthers the sense of the player having a sense of godlike oversight. No one else in the game world, or even their player character, who might otherwise be assigned the role of a god, is impermanent in comparison to the player and their oversight of the game's rules. The player knows what they want to do. They know that they have to build monuments. They know that they have to slightly manipulate, but also assist the townsfolk. It's an interesting dynamic in which the player gains a really specific role in relation to the game systems, as if having a feeling of being above the world of the game in some way, of being a powerful entity in a way that's not even their in-game powers, but just what they know about the world. That's the first really interesting thing that Doshin the Giant does with its player. It later subverts this in a really, really clever way, which I'm excited to talk about. The second thing the Doshin the Giant does, not so much with the player, I had to put this somewhere within the essay structure and it didn't really fit. That marks the point at which there is no more footage. It's all gone now. we're in the dark. I'm going to create some new visuals for this bit. Anyway, the Doshin the Giant illustrates a world before the basic tenets of our existence as human beings, or our modern existence. The villagers, as they move around, create diegetic noises. They are simple and repetitive hums and whines and sort of clicking sounds. They don't really sound like human vocalization so much as they sound like an abstraction of the idea of vocalization, the idea of singing or humming or wailing, just as a series of noises which are produced by a human rather than the actual tonal range which the human voice creates. The simple repetitive noises suggest a world prior to intentionally developed music and maybe prior to sophisticated language. However, in-game elements and the tutorial character Sadoru suggest that there is some form of language between the people. They hum and whine as they go about their work, but they can also communicate with one another to some degree. Anyway, this illustrates to the player a world before music, basically. A world before clear intention and deviation of different forms of art. It's not quite intuitive, but it's people acting on urges and basic understandings rather than a more elaborate scheme in which they place their creations. All the non-diegetic music within the game, its actual soundtrack, is somewhat dated in nature. It's mostly constituted of sort of 60s surf guitar. It's a really good soundtrack. If you'd like to listen to it, you can search up In the Wake of Doshin the Giant, which is the official soundtrack title. I'm all for soundtracks having titles independent of the game in which the soundtrack comes from. I did that with my soundtrack for Casadastra. I called it Casadastra Sound instead of just Casadastra Soundtrack. This is also lifted slightly from the Sonic Rush soundtrack being called Sonic Rush Original Groove Rush, which is a cool title. Anyway, the 60s surf guitar used within the game's soundtrack is, whilst more modern than the tribal hums of the in-game's humans, is still dated in a way that's very clear to the player. It has a similar effect in implying the past. The player is encouraged through a number of different schemes, or maybe schemes is not the right word, makes it seem like Doshin the Giant is plotting. It's not a plotting game. There are games that do feel like they're plotting, they're trying to get the player to feel something very specific. Doshin the Giant feels like it's working with the player to get to somewhere, rather than trying to pull the player to somewhere. It's honest in its relationship with the player. The surf guitar implies the past through a more cultural means than the direct means of the diegetic noises created by the villagers. Finally, within this idea of the illustration of a world before the basic tenets of our existence, the passage of days is the only marker of time in Doshin the Giant. Despite it being a game which is played on a schedule in which you wake up in the morning and you end a game session at night, there's no in-game clock whatsoever. There's no indication of time passing other than the changing colors of the sky and the position of the sun over the course of the day. This suggests a world set before the game is basically set before the invention of timekeeping, maybe even the idea of linear time at all. The days as they go on don't seem to fit within a greater year. Doshin the Giant doesn't track days as days in sequence. A day itself seems to be the basic unit of time. That's basically the way things would go if you didn't have a calendar. You would just consider each day to fall after the last. Night, in this sort of system in which a day is the longest unit of time, becomes inherently mysterious. It's the dark period before the dawn of a new basic unit of time. When you're not thinking in terms of years, the darkness therefore becomes the equivalent of the end of the year, and you wonder if a new day will begin because you don't understand really what the sun is. Doshin the Giant plays with that. A clear way that it does it is by never letting the player exist during the night. At sundown, Doshin the Giant slows to a halt and stops. Not even the player as God or as a godlike entity is able to understand the night. It is an inherently mysterious thing within the time period that the game is set. bringing me around to the final point in this first body paragraph before I return to myself recording on the 4th of the 1st, 2022, instead of today, which is the 16th of the 1st, 2022. It's currently 3:13 p.m. I'd like to talk about the way the game begins to subvert the player's status as a god. The player assumes themselves to be the most powerful entity within the world of the game, or at least the entity with the most awareness. However, this isn't actually quite true. This is first suggested to the player in the fact that they cannot see night, in the fact that night is alien to them as it is to the villagers. In fact, perhaps more alien to them than it is to the villagers. The villagers at least are implied to exist during the night. The player literally ceases to be, or ceases, literally is the wrong term and it's a cliche, but the player ceases to have any input into the game world over the night. The end of each day is marked by Doshin gradually slowing to a halt. The player's direct inputs on the game controller begin to have less and less impact on the world and therefore demonstrate a loss of player agency over time. The player's role in the world diminishes as the sun goes down. This is the very first suggestion that maybe the player doesn't actually know everything about what's going on, and it leads them to both think about the game itself as sort of, I guess not a superior, because that word has baggage in terms of the way our society uses it, and all the politics surrounding respect as a sort of conservative notion. But the game encourages the player to think of themselves as maybe not all-powerful, because that's not really great for, I guess, anybody in the role of a god to be thinking about, or anybody in a position of power. Doshin the Giant is actually, in a ludological perspective, interested in power and interested in what it means to be somebody in a position of power, though it does this in an extremely subtle way, which I discuss later in the video. This transitions later into discussing, actually, I do have to discuss this bit because I don't have this within the main audio of the video. The second body paragraph discusses trust, humility, and complex bonds. Doshin the Giant, as an extension of its idea that, well, maybe the player doesn't know everything, encourages them to take a position of humility and learn basic lessons about what trust means, how it must be earned rather than given. Players must learn to redeem themselves for poor actions that they make towards the villagers through the system of hate tokens and love tokens. Hate tokens are represented by skulls and love tokens by hearts. Love tokens are gained by doing what the villagers want you to do. There's no penalty for just sort of lazing around and not doing anything the villagers want you to do. Hate tokens are gained from actively not being aggressive per se for the villagers, but doing things that might scare them. Accidentally stepping on one, or knocking over a house, or transforming into your alter ego form Jashin, who's red and evil and can jump really high and shoot fireballs, but frightens everybody they meet. I think I can transition back into the main video from there. Thank you very much for listening to this aside. These asides will not be back till the conclusion of the video. You can feel my touch as the editor in the future rather than the presenter in 16 minus 4 is 12. Rather than the presenter in 12 days past, through the inclusion of extra visuals for all the bits where I lost camera footage. Oh well, it'll be better next year and I'll find something else cool to do at the same time as presenting my thoughts. Okay, back to the main video. Doshin the Giant.
I hadn't been recording audio through the lavalier mics. We'll be working with the directional mic for that bit of audio. I might have to subtitle it. Oh well, I like making more work for myself. That's not even really a joke, it's nice to have things to do. That said, I will also try and make this as quickly as possible to make the video good so that I can work on other stuff. I have plenty more ideas. If love tokens, the hearts, fill the edge of the screen, like hate tokens, the player will grow larger. Growing larger increases player move speed and allows them to pick up larger objects. It is a desirable thing for the most part. it can cause slight extra clumsiness, which gives it a slight downside. Hate tokens, once gained, must be overlaid with love tokens. You cannot grow larger on a combination of hate and love tokens. You must have either exclusively a full ring of love or a full ring of hate tokens. This demonstrates the human characters as wishing consistency from their deity. By directing the player to make up for their past misdeeds, by overlaying them with heart tokens, the Doshin the Giant as a game makes a quiet argument about trust and respect being earned rather than being directly given. The idea is that authority is not something bestowed, but is developed through action onto a group of people. That's true. No one should ever assume that they have authority over a group or even over an individual if they're not doing good deeds. The fickle actions of the simplistic human AI educate the player in humility and patience. The human requests are often fickle. They often ask the player to raise the ground and then immediately lower it again, and then raise it again and lower it again, or they get angry if you're standing in the wrong place, or they kind of want you to do something but they just don't tell you, and you walk away, and they get frustrated because you walk away, so you walk back, and they're frustrated that you did that, and you just don't know what they want. This is a core aspect of the game, and not actually a result of poor AI, I believe. It would have been fairly easy, I think, to cover over these problems. Instead, they exist in the game to teach the player, who may consider themselves an all-knowing god who has some sort of divine authority, about ideas of humility. The player's core goal is to tend to the humans, so they build monuments. The player is forced to interact with the humans and to interpret their requests. If the player does not do this, they cannot succeed in the game. Therefore, the player is encouraged to take things slowly and to actually consider the requests of the humans and not think of themselves so highly as to not help, I suppose. The player is forced to be humble. I haven't seen another game that actually tries to create humility through gameplay systems. It's fascinating and highly original. The game, through these ideas of empathy and regained trust and miscommunication and mistakes, demonstrates a potential for all bodies within nature or deities or humans to make mistakes and miscommunicate with each other. The forces then must regain trust between each other. Doshin's large scale results in hapless mistakes. The player, as they grow larger by gaining love tokens, often trips and kind of falls or smashes a village and gets a bunch of hate tokens, and then maybe just scampers off and tries to repair relationships the next day. This happens semi-frequently. The humans also make mistakes. Sometimes they entirely misinterpret your actions. You're trying to help them and they start freaking out, and you put them down and then they don't trust you for a while. They make mistakes as well. Once the giant loses the people's trust, the people must regain confidence from the giant over time, or the giant must regain confidence from the people. There's an idea of miscommunication being fundamental in actions and being something that must be overcome progressively and patiently, which is important. Too often interactions in our world are marked by miscommunication and then, I suppose, no action following that. Just people losing trust for one another and maybe splitting apart, or just sort of never attempting to restore things. The third body paragraph of this essay, and the third point of note in Doshin the Giant, is its exploration of ideas of what the future might mean. This moves in an opposite direction to the idea of folklore that I introduced at the beginning of discussion of Doshin the Giant. The game is interested in the future and potentially wary of what the future may end up reflecting. However, it importantly does not reject the idea of the future and wish to retain the past. It's conflicted about it. It sees virtue in the past and virtue in the future and does not wish for stagnation. It reflects this through the tutorial character Sadoru stating at one point, referring to the giant, or stating, will the giant complete the final monument and risk the consequences, or will he choose a life of repetition without end? The past is represented, though potentially idyllic, as stagnated, as unevolving, is inherently unevolving because of the fact that, or regression to the past as relying on a state of stasis, essentially. That said, it also sees threats in the future. The idyllic island setting is subverted as villagers start to build cannons unsupervised. You leave them alone and they build implements of war. It's genuinely concerning in a game that's otherwise peaceful. The music around towns that have built cannons is strange and distorted. It has a sort of militaristic taboo march to it that is not present in other areas of the game. The game is wary of the future, but also believes that humanity cannot retreat to the past. This uncertainty, demonstrated in its idea of the past as stagnation and the future as potential threat, prevents the game from becoming a fatalistic damnation of humanity. There is an idea, perhaps, in the construction of war engines that human failure is, or war is somehow an element of human nature, but the fact that the past is also reflected as not entirely beneficial contributes to an idea that despite the fact that humans may make mistakes or miscommunicate or have, for instance, wars with cannons, the important factor is regaining trust and regaining peace after that we cannot stay in the past, we will make mistakes in the future, but we must build up again from them. Sadoru, the tutorial character, at another point states, the world would cease to change. I don't know if that would be a good thing or a bad thing, close quote. This very openly summarizes the game's uncertainty. The uncertainty couples with the ludic, as in play, exploration of uncertainty and fallibility to express a world in constant flux. This exists crucially within Doshin's ability to terraform. He changes the landscape. He creates change in the world. The player is an agent of change which moves the world into the future. The conclusion of the game demonstrates a clash between the past and future. Now, I haven't actually gotten to the conclusion of the game myself. I don't know the specific details because I'm genuinely attempt to avoid spoilers in almost all media I interact with. However, I understand it well enough to discuss it. I wouldn't discuss it without checking on the ending. I think that's an important part of a text and can potentially subvert any previous readings made beforehand. Doshin the Giant ends with a clash between the past and the future. I won't specifically describe it because I think it would be something that's worth playing to yourself. It serves to make good on the warnings of the tutorial character in that it is a threat posed by the future. However, it also, following the clash between the past and future, there is an epilogue in which the future is allowed to progress and there is a regaining of sort of the human race is able to recenter itself and move forwards. Sadoru, early in the game, that tutorial character I've mentioned several times, is significant in that he's the only character with written dialogue, states that growing large is not always beneficial. This is initially interpreted by the player as a reference to Doshin's size, and it, in a functional sense, is, though it also refers to the idea of the future changing over time, or human change potentially posing threats in the future. That's it. That's the interesting elements of Doshin the Giant. Its interactions with the idea of, or its idea of the player as God slowly subverted to demonstrate the potential fallibility of their actions and a disconnect between them, the character, and the actual game world. The fact that even the player isn't necessarily aware of everything. There are the... There is an exploration of empathy, trust, and humility through gameplay systems, which I haven't seen replicated in any other game in the same intentful way that essentially always occurs through the manner in which you are made to interact with the game if you have any interest in completing it, and a final exploration of what history might mean and where we might go in future and what an idea of regression to the past might mean. It's a pretty fascinating idea, and it's a nuanced idea explored through very simple game systems. It's a really wonderful singular work of game design, and I think should be considered a fairly significant text. It's fallen by the wayside and should not have. It's a wonderful game and should be played. It's very atmospheric and lovely as well. It's just a joy to have in your hands and move around in, as well as to think about. It's a great game. That concludes talking about video games. According to the watch I have taped to the back of the seat, it's 8:48. I allocated myself roughly 20 minutes to talk about each, but I haven't been paying attention to this. I'm going to give myself until 9 p.m. to talk about the next... Actually, no. I'll give myself until... 8:48. That would be 12 minutes. No, 9 p.m. will work well. I'm going to give myself until 9 p.m. to talk about Simon Ing's novel Hothead, which was originally published in 1992. Hothead is possibly one of the best books I have. Certainly the best book this year. It's one of the books that I'm thinking about most regularly at this point in time. However, that also tends to diminish somewhat after the list is in conclusion. I will not say that it is one of my favorite books of all time yet. That would be reckless. That said, Hothead is absolutely fantastic, and you should read Hothead before I talk about Hothead. Seriously, if you don't want to buy a paperback edition of the book, there was a reprint in 2014, which is pretty accessible. It's on Kindle for like $3. And you don't even need a Kindle to read Kindle books anymore. You can just do that on a phone. I think Kindle stopped competing. Their battery life was cool, but phones exist and people use those more now. Here are some reading tips, not only for Hothead, but for books in general. Split books into quarter chunks. It's a useful way to consume the book, and it allows you to have allows for a greater sense of structure whilst reading. The way you do this is you look at the first page. You locate where the page number is located on the page. You close the book and you close the book. Turn to the back side of the book. Defocus your eyes by crossing them slightly. You open the last page of the book. You refocus your eyes just long enough to see the page number on the last page. You then close the book before you read any of the stuff on the last page. And then from now knowing the total number of pages in the book, you can calculate the quarter marks of pages in the book. Once you've located these quarter marks, you can read to them in sequence. You should calculate the quarter, 1/2, and 3/4 marks of the book. If the numbers of each quarter, half, or 3/4 marks have a decimal place, you should always round the number up to the next page. If the book you're reading has chapters and a quarter chunk ends in the middle of a chapter, you should read to the end of the chapter. That gives you a head start on the reading of the next quarter next time you read. That's how I read books. It's deeply satisfying and allows you to calculate the number of pages left till the next quarter. I had somebody tell me I was scary when I told them that I did that at first, and I think they're wrong. I think I'm just right, and I think it's a great way to read books. Thematically, Hothead, which was published in 1992 but still feels exceedingly modern, it's a very prescient novel in many ways, is interested in interrelation of different aspects of society as well as symbology, the idea of personal agency within that interrelation, and ultimately the unification of biology and technology. It is a science fiction novel, and it's interested in many aspects in ideas of post-humanism. It does it in a very interesting way. It does it in a way that feels unique for me, though I haven't engaged with many other texts that are interested in post-humanism. I think it does it in a way that is still ultimately human. It doesn't feel reckless in its ideas of throwing itself towards integration with technology. It takes a considered approach, an integration of humanity and technology rather than an acceptance of one rather than the other. Its thematic idea of interrelation begins with the interconnection of culture, society, and symbology. Cultures within the novel often act like individuals. The cultures act like individuals, and individuals can influence society. Cultures also influence individuals. Obviously, the way that characters think within the novel are continually inspired or directed by their culture. Culture also influences the internal symbology of individuals. What I mean by that is the subconscious symbolic language which is formed in the mind and used by the human to pass the world around them. The book is deeply interested in these languages in very tangible ways as it progresses. Ings, wow, Simon Ings, the author, presents the personal, cultural, and technological as an interrelated, intersecting, ever-changing set. This contrasts our society's general organization of these concepts as a tiered hierarchy. Instead, he believes that culture, symbology, technology, and the personal all influence each other to some degree and are constantly changing in their relation to each other. It's not necessarily a push and pull, or one always influences the other. It's changing all the time. This follows tarot thematics. The novel is interested continually in the tarot as it progresses, evoking ideas of as above, so below, which are directly stated later in the novel. The protagonist, Melise, has the political related to her personal in her childhood. She is a member of a newly formed state in an alternate history. She is constantly affected by the configuration of her state and the way she interacts with the world and her experience of the present. What's more, the personal influences the culture, as seen in a character who is never introduced but written about, a technological genius, Suriati, who creates von Neumann machines, which is a term used to refer to machines that can replicate themselves and sort of develop solutions to their own problems over time. His personal ambition is able to utterly change the world. Its universal culture alters fundamentally as a result of the introduction of von Neumann machines. Simon Ings presents symbology as a base human mechanism for passing the world. Symbols within the novel are embodied in the tarot. The tarot has important relevance in Melise's history. It becomes a internalized aspect of herself. There is a quote in which Ings there's a quote, "It was the sound of toys breaking, gunfire, daddy's bombs, bodies bursting, semicolon. It was the sound of falling, 5 feet, onto a concrete pavement," close quote. Ings in this moment is presenting an incredibly traumatic instance in which the protagonist is unable to pass the world. They return to their memories interlace with the present in order to allow them to cope or have some mechanism for interpreting what they're interacting with, the current stimuli. Melise is pushed far beyond the abilities of her conscious mind to cope. As her unconscious takes over, Ings displays human perception as founded on a basis of past experience. Symbology, like all other factors in human life, is shown to be mutable. Melise's past and culture affect her symbolic language. Symbology is not something that is inherent to any given human. It changes based on their interaction with the world around them. Woo! The wind is picking up my notes. Symbology is also shown interlacing with the present, and Melise's idea of, open quote, "sacrificial metaphors filled the room, full stop. Their talk with incantation, their screens scented fires," close quote. Ings portrays folklore as a base symbolic language for the manner in which humans pass the world, hence the relevance of the tarot as a symbolic language representing the intersection between folklore and prediction and the way humans pass the world around them. In the unknown, he conceives that we parallel the symbols of our culture and mind with the world around us to locate ourselves inside of experience and divine a path. Ings suggests that the resonant intersection of culture, society, symbology, and experience creates magic. Ings has Melise directly read, open quote, "What is above is similar to what is below." Open quote, "What is below is similar to what is above," close quote. Directly quoting the book and importantly quoting it accurately is important. In Melissa's view, magic is not oppositional to conscious analysis or knowledge. This is the way it is often presented by our society. The concept of magic or the occult moves in contrary to science or contrary to ration or reason. That is not the way in which Ings or Melisse considers magic. Instead, magic is an intersection of emotion, fascination, and understanding. She states, open quote, history, comma, love, comma, language, comma, laughter, dash, they all met here, close quote. Ings includes personal agency as a core thematic through line of his text. This is important in that it makes sure that the protagonists and the characters are not simply directed by their culture and internal symbology. They still make decisions for themselves and direct themselves as they move through the world. He presents his characters, especially Melisse, as having a confident ability to now analyze those around them. Ings's description of the underlying emotions of his characters are essential. It presents to the audience the concept that almost all humans can be understood with sufficient perceptiveness. This combats a dominant societal notion that humans are too nuanced to be readily understood. This idea within society that we cannot analyze the people around us is untrue. The concept seeks to prevent people exercising their perception to understand the underlying motivations of others. Most people in this world, I say this genuinely, are easily understood. Most people do not think about the reasons they do things. This is not directly insulting you as the viewer of this video, though I'm sure you have reference points in your life for people who don't consider the way they move through the world and don't consider the rationale behind their actions. Ings presents these people as being able to be read. The faux moralistic within our society, the faux moralistic refusal to engage with others' worldviews within our society is parallel to ideas of cringe and pretentiousness in that it, on a basic level, attempts to prevent people from thinking deeply about the world around them or thinking in a non-traditional way, as they are threatened with social ostracization as a result. An example of the way in which Ings presents characters as being able to be read is Melissa's childhood judgment that, open quote, that an American she's seeing has, open quote, a jovial mood, but there was panic behind his eyes, close quote. The cast is presented, in terms of personal agency, as being continually psychologically aware of their own states and the states of others, and having an ability to reinterpret the inputs they take from the world around them. Ings resists the risk of his characters seeming hapless vectors acting only on outside factors through their awareness of themselves. Melisse, the protagonist, runs regular diagnostics on herself, open quote, sensing for damage, comma, the way she'd been taught to, close quote. Melissa's ability to persist despite complete instability and constantly diminishing agency within her life is portrayed as learned from past trauma. If we return to the ideas presented in Yakuza 0, this is not significantly dissimilar from the way Tachibana and Majima were presented. At the same time, despite having learnt from past trauma, Melisse is exceedingly competent and aware of her own mental state. She has routines in place for recentering herself and understanding where she's at. Melisse is never shown in the comfort of routine. Her form itself is unstable as she takes on additional modifications within her mind. She takes on experimental, what is called data fat, developed by a character named Snow. Melisse conceives, open quote, her idea of herself was ... warping ... to fill the new spaces ... she thought to fill the new spaces inside of her. I think inside of her. I haven't got that directly written as the quote. ... she thought ... I've killed the human in me, close quote. Ings rejects the concept of memory as the whole cause for later human actions. The Massive, which is a collection of von Neumanns, which is in some regard progressively evolving upon itself, is shown to places an idea in Melissa's mind through a sort of specifically constructed entity. This shows that there are forces larger than individual experience at play in the human mind. Through Melise, Ings refuses an idea of mimetic fatalism. Melise recognizes the maps in her mind and chooses how to act on them. She is not entirely subject to those actions. She is not entirely subject to the idea, the content of her mind. Ings suggests that while larger forces may be at play in human experience, individuals must always take agency over themselves. Ings's writing is eminently self-confident. This contributes to the sense of agency. Ing's written description demonstrates nested self-evident truth. His written confidence extends in demonstrating potentially the that other people can be confidently analyzed extends to written descriptions of non-human consciousnesses. It functions as a logical extension of the proposition that we are able to efficiently understand other humans. His descriptions of consciousness are fascinating. Ings portrays technology as liberating individuals from even fundamental human perception, as Melise interfaces with the dog and comes to control it. Ings's writing demonstrates empowering certainty. Every implicit ideology in his text is presented without doubt or contradiction. It is possible to understand others. Social groups are ever-altering representatives of the desires of their members. Folkloric symbology is the root vector of humans' understanding. This certainty gives the novel's descriptions of magic solidity and influence. The width of stimuli in Ing's environmental descriptions encourages the audience to find basic parallels within their experience with the novel itself. From there, they can come to recognize Ings's judgments or his truths, which are nested within the narrative, as self-evident. Once they understand the narrative as portraying truths within their own life, they can come to understand the narrative as containing other truths. They're able to interpret those, and there are many truths within the narrative. I find new truth in it every time I read it. It reflects more of what I've learned about the world, more about the way in which humans interact and the way in which we exist. It's a very significantly truthful novel in a way that many others aren't, or many other novels seem to contain one core truth, but not as many importantly true aspects as Ings's writing. The final core engagement of the text is its idea of the unification of the biological and technological. The progressive alignment of data fat, which is the idea of technology implanted within the human mind, which interface with the human mind, and von Neumann collective technologies, demonstrates a unification of biology and technology. The von Neumanns are the multiplying machines I described earlier. They're able to form a consciousness over time. A group of them, called the Massive, forms a consciousness within the outer ring of Jupiter and begins to form itself into a sort of an entity. The flesh mass generated in Sea Ledge, which is a orbital research facility, is a biological inverse of humanity's mechanical von Neumanns. Technology and biology begins to converge in their abilities. Snow, who is a character who has pioneered a new form of data fat which is unbelievably powerful, recognizes the burgeoning attunement of technology and biology as she cries, open quote, "If you can't fuck it, comma, kill it, colon. Melise, comma, you can't afford to do that anymore, close quote, full stop." Ing stresses the similarity of biology and technology through description. Machines are rendered as open quote limbs, close quote, comma, open quote drip, open square bracket, Ing, close square bracket, cyanoacrylate adhesive, close quote. Melise observes a drone as indecently limb-like, as she, stating open quote, open square bracket, she, close square bracket, could not bring herself to focus on its glittering mucosal membranes and jittering, comma, roomy eyes, close quote. Ings reflects the technology implanted within the human mind and the technologies that are beginning to form consciousnesses of their own as fundamentally aligned. humans and technology are becoming alike in a way that is progressively becoming less and less easy to distinguish. This is the ultimate statement of the narrative towards its conclusion, and it does very interesting things with this. Specifically, it re-relates this with its ideas of interrelation and the tarot and symbology. Myth is generated from memes, or not memes in the current context of that word, but as in memetics, and as in memetics as almost contagious items of meaning. I may at some point soon need to use a torch to read these notes, but I'll work by the darkness for a while I can.
Consider that your face might want to be lit up as well.
Oh yes, sorry. I have a floor-mounted light and I'd forgotten.
How much longer do you reckon you want? Just by the way. Because I'll adjust them. I know exactly.
Give me 25 minutes.
25 minutes?
Yeah, I'm going longer than I thought I would. I apologize. I'm moving quicker now than I was before.
Yeah, I know where we're going. That's fine.
Excellent. Story engines are incorporate an element of Snow's data fat, the new experimental data fat. Story engines are a environment within the human mind which acts as an interface between the technology and the human mind. They populate themselves using the existing symbology and memetics inside the mind of the user. Story engines allow Ings to make the personal physical and have his characters move within the items of symbology within their own mind. It's really brilliant, lovely, in many ways honest narrative structuring. The personal is founded on interrelation between the individual and the outside world, the culture and society and technological. The audience is shown Melise, the protagonist's past, allowing them to recognize the unconscious influences her memories have on her later actions. This is reflected in Melisa's choice to play among, open quote, tidal pools and sand-filled basins, close quote, within the story engine. It obliquely echoes a childhood excursion to the beach she made with her father. The inside of the Jovian, which is the massive collective formed by the massive outside of the, or within the orbit of Jupiter, it's a sort of planet-eating mechanism, which is described as like an eggshell with from which innumerable limbs extend, breaks reality down into its basest symbolic elements. In an interpretive interface between human minds and an unbelievably vast consciousness, as Melise enters the consciousness of the Jovian herself, a new plane of myth is generated. The Jovian is stated as, open quote, the kind of informational matrix that is less suited to the lives of individuals than to the modeling of whole civilizations, close quote. The idea is that once one human exists in that, the symbology within their own mind and their culture is extrapolated to its largest possible state. The human being becomes dwarfed by the enormity of, I suppose, culture and the ideas within their own mind. Essentially, a new plane of myth is generated within technology in which characters relive folklore and become items of folklore in a state of semi-consciousness. It's incredible. I have never read any novel that does anything like it nearly as well. I remember people heaping praise on the video game Soma, and where praise is due, Soma seems pretty cool, but Hothead does what Soma did and then does about 1,000 other things, which are just brilliant. It is such an incredibly structured piece of narrative. It's just wonderful. Give me a second to get back on track with my notes. Ings culminates his themes of agency and interrelation between culture and the mind and the personal and the external by driving Melise as his protagonist to action, to agency within a world constructed from the human mind. It's amazing. And in this, he reflects a sort of final point of symbols as symbols as having the ability to act as a communication vector between the technological and personal. Ings places symbols as the communication vector between unified biotechnological consciousnesses. The Jovian is not really able to think like a human, and Melise is definitely not able to think like the Jovian. It is, once again, an informational matrix suited to the modeling of a whole civilization. However, through the ideas of folklore and symbology, they are able to interact, specifically through the base unit of information stored within the tarot. The tarot becomes a language with its cards constituting a meaning set. This language is used to describe causality and personality. Its interpretations shift culturally. Ings uses the tarot as a broad-scale representation of interrelation within society. Or no, not society, just within the whole of reality, within the world, how the human existence interrelates with everything around it. Symbols allow for the expressions of concept much greater than the complexity of the symbols themselves. Symbols as the intersection of technology, society, culture, and etc. become magically charged in Melissa's definition of magic as an intersection between different units of meaning. The Jovian makes those aspects, that magic, physical, essentially. The Jovian acts as a manifester of magic in a clear sense. That concludes my discussion of Hothead. Essentially, Hothead is a wonderful novel. It is a almost singular piece of fiction, which is unbelievable considering it was Simon Ings' debut novel. I've subsequently read one other novel by him, The Smoke. I will not talk to you about The Smoke. I will talk to some other people about The Smoke some other time. Hothead is a wonderful novel in how it expresses human experience and its interrelation with a number of factors. It eschews the possibility of becoming depressive in some way or judging humans as exclusively directed by factors outside of themselves, by presenting humans as always having the capacity to have consciousness and agency. What's more, it demonstrates an insightful analysis of symbols and technology and the world in which we live. It contains so many resonant, true ideas. I'm going to take another swig of water and unblock my ears. They're significantly blocked. The final item of discussion today is Frank Ocean's 2016 album Blond. I had planned, in previous years, I have included multiple albums. This year I included multiple pieces of multiple video games. However, I listened to Blond about midway through this year. Following listening to Blond, the selection process for music within this year became, is the music as good as Blond? That never happened once. There was no album throughout the year where I thought, yes, this is as good as Blond. So Blond is the only item on the list. This comes through an interest in only including items which are relevant and which I will consider in future. I said that last year and I continue to mean it this year. I want to include items which will continue to be relevant for me within future and which I'll continue to look back on. Blond is a fantastic album. It deserves all the critical praise it has gotten. If you've been avoiding it because you've seen it around too many times or because it's mainstream, you should, one, listen to mainstream music. Pop within the mainstream is essential and wonderful, and there's a reason it's great. Things usually don't get to the top of the charts if they're not very good. That's a rule. I can understand not liking it, but also try to think about it a bit. Anyway, I have a few listening tips for Blond, and these can be used more universally, though these are specifically directed towards Blond. 1, listen to the album in complete sequence. Don't shuffle play the album, don't just start at a song you want to listen to. Seriously, listen to start to finish. That's the reason musicians make albums instead of releasing a bunch of singles. It's because the music works as a sequence and as a unit. If you stop at a certain song on one listening, start again from that song the next time you listen. You don't have to start the album every time. That becomes cumbersome and discourages you from listening. Next, if you want to be really ambitious, attach all the songs together in one long MP3 file. Do not include the track listing along with the file and use that file as your core primary copy of the album. I'm not convinced that knowing the titles of songs or knowing which songs are which actually really helps with the album, and I think Blond flows together so nicely in one long continuity that it would be lovely to listen to without actually knowing the sequence or knowing the names of parts of the sequence. It's nice to preserve some mystery and unknown surrounding art. Frank Ocean's Blond is interested in freedom, independence, and Frank Ocean's Blond is interested in freedom, is interested in societal pressures, and is interested in, I suppose, a sense of liberation. Overall, though, what it represents is an essentially non-binary narrative in which it eschews ideas of basic strength or weakness or any sort of specifically defined societal role in favor of a human experience and existence based upon a changing self over time. It presents this throughout its entire run, refusing to maintain any specific singular judgment or idea. It maintains singular ideas, but no specific tone or resolve. It moves through states of life in the same way that it believes human beings should. It's lovely, and I don't think I've seen discussion of the narrative as refusing binary. In fact, I've seen people try to establish it within a binary, which I think misses the point almost entirely. I'll discuss that a little more later. Anyway, Frank Ocean is definitely interested in freedom and independence. He expresses fluid humanity through love and connection with others. Ocean's relationships within the album, or the personas of the relationships Ocean shows, are often marked by eventual divergence. The song Self-Control contains a romantic imbalance in which neither figure loves the other at the same time. Experiences with love have consequences that affect personas into the future. In the song Ivy, Frank Ocean states, open quote, "I broke your heart last week. You'll probably feel better by the weekend," close quote. There's an idea of transition and growth, and transition and growth through love and out of love and between love, but those connections as milestones in the life of a human being. The final song, the line, open quote, "I will always love you," close quote, in one of the closing songs of the album subverts the previous detached push and pull of open quote, "You'll probably feel better by the weekend," close quote. There's different states of intimacy displayed throughout the album. Ocean swears, open quote, "Godspeed, glory," close quote, to a past lover in their future. Longing is notably absent in Ocean's depictions of past love. He refreshingly never pines for a lost lover or calls for somebody to return. That's not a part of the narrative. At the next intersection, take a right. I'm probably going to need longer to talk.
Yeah, I know.
Got it.
You mean at the roundabout?
Yes.
Yeah, no, so I was going to do that anyway, it's fine.
Okay, excellent, thank you.
Read your mind.
Ocean represents this sense of freedom over the course, musically, through textural and musical expanse, specifically through use of reverb and delay. However, Frank Ocean uses reverb and delay better than anyone else I've ever heard in my life. Reverb and delay are often used within music to create a sense of the immaterial, a sense of kind of trying to combine different sounds together. Frank Ocean does kind of the opposite. Nike's has very clear delay, only about 3 or 4 repeats of each kick drum or snare with delay, which make a sense, all of which are clearly identifiable. The audience are given a sense that the sounds are ricocheting about in space. The sense of space is not tied to an actual physical environment, but to an idea of motion. If you're interested in that, you'll like some stuff I'm doing in future. The physicality is built through motion, not through replication of reality. That's something wonderful in art, which is not yet explored quite enough, I don't think. He creates a sense of expanse within the text, within the alternate verse delivered by Ko on the, or Kohh, on the alternate version of Nike's released in the pop-up, in the CD contained within the pop-up version, pop-up magazine, Boys Don't Cry, which contains several alterations from the wide distribution version of Blond. You should listen to both. My preferred order is listening to the co-verse with the overall album, or the alternate Nikes, but retaining the original wide distribution version of Pretty Sweet. Ocean also creates a sense of expanse using reference to places. In Solo, the song Solo, he comments, quotes, or references, open quote, Colorado, close quote, and open quote, the Windy City, close quote. He does this a fair few times. Winding ambient composition creates a sense of expanse as well. There's a great sense of space. Ocean gives the audience, however, a handhold through the ambience in the foregrounding of traditional drum beats. He always makes sure to have a clearly identifiable rhythmic element somewhere within the music. It's a way to give the audience some way to identify with the music rather than simply being sort of lost within it. His vocals also supply a through line. He demonstrates within his idea of fluidity and freedom and independence and movement, certainty and despair as transitional states. Ocean portrays certainty and trepidation as equally transitory. In Ivy, he states, open quote, deep down the feeling still ... good, close quote. This confidence shown here is tempered by the uncertain, open quote, maybe I should settle down. 3 kids in a swimming pool, close quote, in Siegfried. In assessing emotions as constantly passing, Ocean, as I previously stated, argues for humanity defined by change. This combats society's idea of immutable roles. Ocean muses, open quote, been living in an idea called, then I've got a backslash because it's another line, an idea from another man's mind, close quote. The idea that people are trying to conform themselves to ideas that are generated by others or generated collectively, but are not actually suitable for the individual, that are representative of some societal idea that is made to make things move more smoothly, maybe for the unit, but actually de-incentivizes the individual in a way that's harmful. Ocean, in displaying a sort of non-binary narrative or text in opposition to society's immutable roles, is interested in societal pressures. He's interested in the oppression by expected roles and personas, both personas within average day-to-day life taken by the majority of the population and those taken by people within fame. He states within Pretty Sweet, open quote, mothers of earth be kind to the fathers on whom we rely. Fathers of earth be kind to the mothers on whom we rely, close quote. This format constitutes a plea for empathy between different groups within society who are too often defined by their deviation from one another. People should identify with each other on the way they interact with each other. In the final song, Future of Free, he relates the importance of his relationship with others as based on the amount of time he's known them, open quote. How, open quote, not open quote, far back they go, basically. He directly approaches or comments on personas when he states, open quote, preaching self-made millionaire status when we could only eat at Shoney's on occasion, close quote. He also makes a line about having sex when he couldn't afford a mattress in the same song. He's talking basically about the idea of roles that we play, or ideas of facades that we put up in order to fit within a greater culture that doesn't suit us. He repeatedly portrays in opposition to society employment as drudgery. Ocean makes traditional employment synonymous with turmoil, essentially, attacking society's expectations by proxy. The beleaguered are presented as turning to bleak practicality. This is particularly demonstrated on Nights, which is the centerpiece of the album. Employment becomes predatory in its domination of struggling lives. On Nights, Ocean's persona is transparently depressive in a way that he isn't in the first half of the album. He reflects an idea of disconnection from his lover and a sense of only really seeking physical pleasure or existing only in self-preservation. He states, open quote, you need the money if you're gonna survive the everyday shit, the every night shit, everyday shit. It feels very too missing the point not to be singing these lines, but I can't recall them off the top of my head immediately. I'll do it as it comes. Ocean has a unique talent for exploring and expanding on existing symbols within society. This is especially present within sports cars across the narrative. He uses them as signifiers of freedom within dominant culture. He evolves the symbol by ignoring the idea of destination. Cars are rendered simply an enabler of motion. This contributes to thematic ideas of passage and human evolution within the text. Cars are used not to go somewhere, to end somewhere, but simply to go and progress as humans evolve over the course of the narrative, or as humans are defined within his writing as change. I shouldn't refer to it as a narrative because the album isn't so much a narrative as it is bordering closer to a collection of poetry. I say poetry very intentionally. I don't consider most music poetic, but I think Ocean, in his controlled use of discomfort and abrasion, not necessarily only within music, but also within his songwriting, is actually resembling poetry. I think poetry is defined less by its prose and beauty and more by its willingness to be uncomfortable. I think that's the core aspect of poetry, its willingness to interact with all elements of language. I think Ocean genuinely does this throughout his writing. Many of the songs are uncomfortable and strange, or represent human experience in a way that is sort of bizarre and disgusting, or alternately sublime and beautiful. One of his expressions of sports cars is him saying, open quote, gliding on the 5, the gear run across, cut the headlights, close quote. I find that line beautiful. I especially love cut the headlights. The idea of just sort of moving with the car, gliding on the 5, presents the idea of the car almost floating above the road. This is the feeling of the song White Ferrari for its entire runtime. There's the sense that it starts in the car and then the car loses almost traction and continues and deconstructs and abstracts in midair. It's beautiful and peaceful and strange, and a really unique use of cultural symbols to represent something greater than what they're usually used to show. He also explores societal symbols by lifting melodies from famous pop choruses of the past 60 years. He directly lifts a melody from the Beatles' Here, There and Everywhere in White Ferrari. It catches you off guard, and it is an interesting way to demonstrate intertextuality within music in a way that I hadn't considered ever doing before. In future, it would be interesting to expand my analysis by reflecting on the songs that he lifts melodies from, how they relate to the ultimate ideas within his work, or the songs in which those melodies exist. In an interview, Pharrell Williams, who is pretty cool, stated that he doesn't believe Frank Ocean has ever done anything that he doesn't really feel, which I deeply respect as an artistic goal. Well, not so much an artistic goal. I deeply respect the artistry of. Therefore, I feel as if I should genuinely analyze every aspect of the whole of his work. Ocean concludes Blond in a number of ways. He notably contrasts the idea. This is similar to some of the things that I talked about in Hothead, with his portrayal of humans as moving between event to an event, as a free-flowing state in which they change and evolve over time rather than being limited to a specific role, has the potential to demonstrate humans as never needing to learn from mistakes or actually developing themselves based on their past experience, or human life as somehow not human life as lacking context in itself. However, he doesn't do this. he does demonstrate human actions as having consequences, and therefore subverts the idea that we have no responsibility to one another or responsibility to ourselves. The child choir on Pretty Sweet is an evocation of this. They evoke succession and continuance. They cry, and their voices place Ocean's experiences and his own relations of childhood experiences in context of a subsequent future generation which will exist. Your actions aren't simply, your actions don't exist in a vacuum. They will inspire the actions of people in future. You will be an influence to someone, and therefore you have to act deliberately, even if you don't act in the same way forever. On Solo, Ocean states, open quote, "Your baby mama ain't so vicious. All she wants is her picket fence, and you protest and you pick a side, but them courts won't side with you," close quote. This is a pretty clear demonstration that he doesn't believe that freedom and transit and evolution is synonymous with a lack of responsibility to one another. We all are evolving in our own way, and we have to demonstrate kindness to one another in order to allow one another to continue changing and growing. Futura Free, as the final track on the album, is genuinely lovely in that it represents a turn to optimism. The first several tracks on the album are confident and optimistic, but from around Solo potentially onwards, and really consolidating itself in Nights, the album takes a not dour but harrowed sort of approach, in which it represents hardship constantly. Futura Free, on the other hand, has Ocean look back to his previous hardship and recognize what he's lived through, and then find strength in his ability to survive. He assesses the growth he's gone through in transit. A line that demonstrates this is him stating, open quote, Bugatti left some stretch marks on that freeway, close quote. The stretch marks are on human skin, obviously, not on the road. It evokes the idea of a burnout or markings left by a human, a legacy, whilst also the idea of growth through transit. It's a really beautiful line. The album is full of beautiful lines. It's full of beautiful musicality. His vocal lines and melodies flow in a really amazing way. And he's saying amazing things while doing it. Along with this, Ocean demonstrates in the Futura Free a newfound acceptance of pleasure, which he hasn't quite been able to accept in past songs. There's been a sense of detachment from intimacy or the relationships he has with others, which he's now able to accept. On Solo, there's a fear of relying upon drugs in the skit, open quote, "Be yourself," close quote, a sort of societal traditional role in the form of a mother via a voice message berates the idea of using marijuana or drinking alcohol, which is almost immediately gleefully refused in Solo, with Ocean stating he's off tabs of acid. It contrasts previous trepidation around pleasure. I think that's significant in Ocean's role as a bisexual man, and how that permeates the work. He demonstrates also an idea of there being multiple valid answers throughout the runtime of Blond. This is connected to the idea of a refusal of binaries. This is demonstrated within the overlapping voices within the final interview within Blond. Ocean identifies himself within the friends that he interviews, his younger brother, his late younger brother, and several other friends. Through their answers, he represents his own self developed out, he represents his own self, developed out of the people who have influenced him. He also demonstrates the existence of multiple valid answers with the sort of meta text of the album through releasing multiple versions of the album with different variations on songs and multiple differing album covers, all of which are as legitimate as one another. The album doesn't even have one set title. It's spelled in different ways depending on where it goes. This is representative of, I believe, the non-binary ideas within the album. The idea there is blonde without an E and blonde with an E. This is often associated with an idea of a masculine-feminine binary. However, I think that's entirely missing the point. Instead, the idea is it adds nuance to discussion. There is no one way, right way to refer to this, as there is no one right way for a person to be. And that's the through line of the whole album, this idea of duality and not duality, but non-binaryism of the non-binary and of the nuanced and complex. It's they're similar in nature, though I think it's worth saying both.
I said it's me.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've been thinking that for the last 20 minutes.
Yeah. I've got a couple more notes to go, but I should be done in time.
Sweet.
Constant demonstration of differing emotional states. Yeah.
The album demonstrates the refusal of any singular answer through its demonstration of continually changing emotional states. That's the manner in which the album starts out optimistic and moves through troughs and valleys of depression and comes back out to moments of light, or finds beauty in moments of darkness, or tinges moments of happiness with strangeness and darkness, and refuses to ever be in one particular state. The album's ideas of a refusal of binary are important in the meta context of the album's success and of Ocean's artistic significance. Throughout the album, Ocean, with the release of his album Channel Orange, came out as either gay or bisexual. He's never stated directly, and it doesn't really matter. What matters is that he's not attracted necessarily to any one particular group of people. None of the lovers or very few of the lovers in Blond are directly gendered. The skit, or not even a skit, it's a song, partially a skit, open quote, called Good Friend, makes homosexuality text rather than implied. Ocean refers to going to a gay bar with a man and sort of feels strange about the way that man treats him. He doesn't text like he looks, and he talks too much, way more than Ocean does. The album is importantly highly successful and critically acclaimed. It was notably Pitchfork's first best album of the decade, or top ranked album of the decade. It's a genuinely highly loved and respected album. It's the fact that a message that is contrary to almost the entirety of the way society is configured right now is able to be recognized, accepted, and loved by a huge amount of people, I think is representative of the album's emotional resonance, as well as its immaculate construction and Ocean's absolute confidence in his ideas. It's essential as a successful album representing these themes within the modern day. In Future Are Free, Ocean joyfully states, open quote, "I ain't had no job since 2008 and 9. I ain't on no sales for. You say I'm changing on you," close quote. This signals liberation from culturally accepted mundanity. He is changing. He's able to have gained success apart from the traditional employment which he represents as drudgery. He's escaped and he's living for himself in a way that is uplifting and wonderful, and supplies not necessarily a template in his fame, but a template for the manner in which humans can live in opposition to society's overall ideas. Ocean
in his saying, open quote, "You say I'm changing on you," close quote, is visibly pushing away from a voice of traditionalism. That's Blond. Obviously, because all the works on this list are some of the best media I've interacted with in a year, in which I've interacted with a genuinely enormous amount of media, or more so than previous years, they're all fantastic in a way that cannot exactly be expressed in my language. My analysis falls short, and I'm moving this as more of a thematic and textual analysis in that frames my thoughts around it. I can return to these albums and media, or the album and book and 2 video games in future and experience the same emotions again. I really genuinely believe you should interact with this media. Blond is wonderful and essential, and one of the best albums I've heard in a long time. I listen to music more so than I play video games or read books or watch films. I listen to music regularly and with intensity and with a lot of focus. I think it's important. I think it's a wonderful medium. Blond's demonstrations of freedom, its ability to be genuinely poetic, its amazing musical poise in its use of ambience, reverb, delay, drum lines, and creating its expressions of a way that humans can exist apart from the way the world exists currently and is largely, I believe, hurting people, is wonderful. It's a brilliant album. I think modern art, art currently, shouldn't be a controversial opinion, but is, because lots of people are fools and don't know how to recognize things that are good. Modern artwork in the modern day is as good as art has ever been, if not better. Art is getting better all the time. There's amazing things being made constantly. You do have to look for them, but that's been the way with art all the time for, basically forever. Art's getting better. I love interacting with art. It's important for me as an artist. It's important for me as a person in that it gives greater awareness of the perspectives of others. It allows me to inform my own work. Art is richly emotional. It can demonstrate ideas. It can demonstrate textural focuses. It can refocus the perception on the world. It can do a whole number of things. Art, in my current conception, or one of my conceptions of art, is the only medium which non-patronizingly, or the only mechanism through which people in the modern day are non-patronizingly encouraged to engage with their own perception and consciousness. It encourages people through displaying memories or ideas or textures and emotions to engage with how they've felt those emotions and ideas in past, and then they reflect on themselves and their relationship to the world, and then can potentially change. There's not a lot else within our world that's actually doing that, and it's crucial. It's wonderful. I love art, god damn it. I love art. I love making art. I love interacting with it, and I intend to do amazing things in future. I'm making things all the time. I'm getting better at making things. I've made note to thank my friends for this year. My relationship with my friends is, I could have done it without you, but I'm very glad I didn't. I feel confident in my own ability to make ends meet, but I'm glad I didn't have to. I'm glad I was able to talk to people. I have some really wonderful people in my life who I love knowing. I'm genuinely grateful to know and talk to in any way. I'm gonna keep making things constantly forever, basically, regardless of what happens. I don't intend to do anything else. I'm confident and assured in my ideas. I think you'll see that more and more as time progresses. In fact, you will see that more and more as time progresses. I don't need to think it, I just know. Thank you very much for watching.